On the day July 7, 1962, a young woman from 20 years DWayers called Audrey Backeberg, she disappeared without a trace. She lived in Reedsburg, a small town of Wisconsin, and that day, it seemed like just another ordinary routine. Audrey, who worked at a local factory, left home to collect her paycheck as she always did. But he never returned. When Audrey didn't return home, her family was in shock. There were no signs of a struggle, no trace of where she could have gone, and surprisingly, no one had ever seen her anywhere else in the city. She didn't arrive at the factory, she wasn't found at any bus stop, and, by all indications, it simply disappeared. The authorities were quickly alerted, and the city was mobilized. But as time passed, the clues became increasingly scarce. No witnesses saw her after she left home, and, even worse, there was no reasonable explanation for what could have happened to Audrey. The case of Audrey Backeberg quickly became an enigma. The police investigated several possibilities. Could she have been the victim of a crime, or had she decided to disappear on her own, leaving behind everything she knew? The truth is that nobody knew. As the investigation unfolded, the mystery only deepened. Some speculated that Audrey might have run away to escape a difficult marriage. Her husband, though seemingly concerned, had been accused of assault and threats against her. It was known that their relationship was troubled, but no one would ever have imagined that the solution to the mystery could be something so surprising. Where was Audrey? What happened to her on that fateful day? Why didn't she give any sign of life? These questions remained unanswered for more than 6 decades, and with each passing year, the case seemed to be swallowed by the dust of time, until, one day, a shocking twist. It happened. But before continuing the story and revealing everything that happened, I need to ask you, subscribe to the channel, leave the like and activate the notifications. This is very important so that you don't miss any chapter of this incredible story. Believe me, what's coming next will surprise you, and every detail is worth following to the end. Don't forget, the truth about Audrey's disappearance is more mysterious than you imagine, and I guarantee that the resolution of this case will leave you speechless. So, stay with me until the end, because you won't want to miss how this fascinating story unfolds. The disappearance of Audrey Backeberg. 1962 was not just a shocking event for the small town of Reedsburg, but it also became a national enigma, generating speculation that spread rapidly. What seemed like a simple trip to collect his salary soon turned into one of the biggest disappearance mysteries of the time. Investigations began immediately, but what seemed like a simple case became increasingly intricate and difficult to unravel. After her disappearance, the local police in Reedsburg were called in to investigate and soon found themselves facing a complicated situation. There were no clear signs of violence in her home, no trace of a struggle, or any other obvious clue suggesting that something terrible had happened there. Audrey he disappeared without a trace, and the authorities were perplexed. When the first wave of searches revealed nothing concrete, the local police began to wonder, could it have been a voluntary disappearance? The idea that Audrey had run away alone didn't seem so improbable. Her marriage was going through a difficult time. Her husband, an aggressive and possessive man, Audrey had already been the subject of complaints and accusations of domestic violence. There were reports that he frequently threatened her, and neighbors noticed a growing tension between the two. Audrey, by all accounts, was in an emotionally oppressive situation, and many people believe she might have fled to escape this abusive reality. But something didn't add up. When discussing a disappearance, the reason behind the act often explains what happened next. In Audrey's case, many wondered why she didn't leave any kind of message or clear clue for her family, friends, or even anyone who could help her. If she really wanted to start her life over somewhere else, why wouldn't he have left any trace? No letter, no phone call. What could have made Audrey disappear without leaving anything? Not even a simple note. The investigation initially focused on this possibility, voluntary disappearance, but soon, other theories emerged. Some believed that Audrey could have been the victim of something much darker. Was she kidnapped? Or worse, was she murdered? Without any physical evidence, it was impossible to tell. The case became a real mystery, labyrinth of possibilities. And the more investigators tried to find clues, the deeper the mystery became. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread. Some people believed that Audrey had run away with another man, someone she had secretly met. Other theories suggested that she was alive, but I didn't want to be found, and that his disappearance could have been a way of escaping everything and starting a new life under a new identity. As the case progressed, the authorities made several attempts toward constructing Audrey's final moments. They discovered that on the last day she was seen, she had been viewed hitchhiking near the city of Madison, and then continued towards Indianapolis. The fact that she was hitchhiking and heading to another state generated even more speculation. Some people claimed she had left for a distant city where no one knew her, while others believed Audrey might have been convinced to embark on something far more dangerous than a simple escape. But there was something that the investigations couldn't explain: the absence of any communication from Audrey after her disappearance. If she was trying to escape, why didn't she contact anyone, not even a close friend or someone she trusted? There was no reports of calls or mysterious letters that would indicate she was alive, safe, and trying to start her life over. This only deepened the mystery surrounding her decision. As the investigation progressed, some more distorted hypotheses began to circulate. Some believed that Audrey had been the victim of a crime, but without sufficient clues, the police couldn't confirm anything. The city of Reedsburg, with its usual tranquility, found itself plunged into a whirlwind of uncertainty. If she was alive, where was she? And if it weren't, who could be responsible? The police then resorted to various other tactics to try to find out what happened to Audrey. One of them was research on possible sightings her in other cities and states. The case was widely publicized, and many people claimed to have seen Audrey in different parts of the country. However, these leads were never concretely confirmed. It seemed that the young woman had disappeared from the map, and nobody really knew where she was. And what happened to her husband during the investigation? Questions arose about his role in the disappearance. Some witnesses said he seemed strangely calm-faced with the situation. It was as if he already knew what had happened to his wife, but no one could prove that he had anything to do with her disappearance. At the time, he was questioned, but there was not enough evidence to incriminate him, and he ended up being ruled out as a suspect. However, he also remained silent, not helping to solve the mystery. As the months and years passed, the Audrey Backeberg case slowly faded, the media lost interest, and the police began to prioritize other, more urgent cases. However, Audrey's disappearance was never forgotten. Her name was still mentioned, and her story became increasingly relevant. Unsolved mystery. Where was she? What happened? The case, although unresolved, continued to haunt. The memory of Reedsburg's residents remained, as they couldn't understand how a young woman so full of life could disappear so suddenly. Over the following decades, many tried to find answers, but without success. The case seemed destined to be one of those mysteries where the ending would never be found. But while all this was happening, something surprising was about to happen. Decades have passed since the disappearance of Audrey Backeberg, and the case gradually became a distant memory for many. For the police, although it was never completely closed, the case was filed as one of the great unsolved mysteries of the 1960s. For the residents of Reedsburg, Audrey's disappearance became a sad and enigmatic story that no one knew if it would ever be resolved. Audrey's family continued to live with the pain of uncertainty, constantly wondering where she was, what had happened to her, and if she was still alive. Searches were resumed on several occasions over the years, but as always, without significant results. However, as happens with so many missing persons cases, life went on, and Audrey's story was gradually forgotten, her image lost in the mists of time. But then, in 2025, something totally unexpected happened. Audrey's story, which seemed destined for oblivion, it resurfaced in a surprising and shocking way. It all started with a phone call. A phone call that it wasn't made for the Reedsburg police, but for the authorities of a distant city, in a different state. The phone call came from a woman who identified herself as Audrey Backeberg. She wasn't asking for help, nor was she explaining what had happened that day in 1962. In fact, she said very little about her past, but upon hearing her name, the Reedsburg police went into shock. It was Audrey, the same woman who had been considered missing for over 6 decades. How did this happen? Where was Audrey all this time? And, most importantly, why did she decide to show up only now? These questions began to resonate among the investigators, who finally began to look at the case with fresh eyes. Audrey's discovery was more than surprising. She was alive, well, and completely off the radar. But the central question remained. Why had she disappeared without a trace for so long? And the most intriguing thing of all, where was she? And who had she become during those decades? When the police finally contacted Audrey, she revealed that he was not living under his real name. And that, for her, it was important to keep this new identity a secret. The woman who had been reported missing was no longer living in the city where she was born, nor even near any place she knew. She had rebuilt his life completely, far from the people who could know her, in a new city, with a new husband and a new family. She was safe, happy, and, surprisingly, at peace with her choice. Audrey, for her part, explained that her decision to disappear was not made suddenly. She knew that, by doing this, she was leaving behind everything she knew, including her own family. But what intrigued authorities most was the reason behind her decision. She claimed she had fled from an abusive relationship and of a life she no longer wanted. Her decision to disappear, it was a way of start over. But, over time, she had found a balance and didn't want to be found. She described how she finally felt, bookby cutting ties with the past that held her back. However, this reunion was not a simple one, and not everyone was ready to accept Audrey's choices. Reaction of the authorities, it was complex. There was a part of it that was relieved to know she was alive, but at the same time, there were a great many unanswered questions. How could she have lived for so long without being detected? How did she manage to completely change her identity and live for so long without contact with anyone from her past? How did she do that? The most delicate part of this situation involved his family, which was now being confronted with the reality that Audrey had chosen to live apart from them. Her parents, siblings, and friends, who for so many years had nurtured the hope of finding her, were faced with a painful truth. Audrey had made the choice not to return. She didn't want to be found, and she had started her life anew with a new identity, for reasons that only she fully understood. For the police, one of the most complicated issues was the legality of their decision. Audrey had disappeared, voluntarily, and had been living under a new identity, but at the same time, she wasn't committing any crime. She wasn't wanted for identity theft, fraud, or any other crime. She simply disappeared. He made a new life, and now he was at peace with the choices he had made. But there was something else, strange and unsettling, in this story. Audrey was apparently trying to leave everything in the past, no longer wanting to get involved with old friends or people from her hometown. She didn't want to confront the questions. She didn't want to relive the circumstances of her disappearance. She preferred to move on and live her new life, without looking back. And while Audrey's story began to unfold for the world, the mystery surrounding her disappearance continued. How can someone disappear from a city and live without a trace for over 60 years? What happened in the years that followed his disappearance? And above all, why now, after so much time? Is she deciding to reveal herself? If you think this story is surprising enough, wait until you hear the details of how Audrey managed to disappear so effectively and what she went through during those decades. Solving a mystery like this isn't simple, and the answers may be even more surprising than you imagine. After Audrey Backeberg's discovery in 2025, questions about what really happened in 1962 only intensified. The disappearance of a young woman in the prime of her life, without leaving any explanation or clue, became one of the greatest mysteries of the 1960s. Now, with her finally found, the curiosity was immense. What was the reason behind her disappearance? What happened on that fateful day? And why did she choose to disappear for more than 6 decades? Audrey had never spoken openly about the reasons for her escape, and the answers she gave over the years were always vague and perplexing. When questioned, she often spoke of a need to escape and seek a future where she could be free, but detailed explanations were never given. For her, the disappearance was not an impulsive action. It was a planned and, above all, necessary decision. But what had happened in her life to make her feel that the only option was simply to vanish? To understand the depth of what led Audrey to make this choice, we need to go back to her past, to the context she faced. Audrey didn't have a simple life, but it was, in some ways, normal, until her marriage began to deteriorate. She married very young, believing it would bring stability and happiness to her life. However, what should have been a loving union became an emotional battleground. Her husband, who initially seemed to be the ideal man, gradually revealed himself to be abusive and possessive. Reports of abuse began to pile up, but not only physical, the psychological abuse was even more devastating. Audrey was subjected to constant control and threats. Her freedom was being stifled, and her options were becoming increasingly limited. Although she tried to seek help, at that time, options for women in her position were scarce. Support networks were almost non-existent, and society largely still treated domestic abuse as a private matter, an issue that should be resolved within the home. But, like so many others in similar situations, Audrey reached a point where she saw no way out. She began to feel trapped in a life she hadn't chosen, a life where she couldn't be herself. She felt isolated and powerless, unable to change her situation. The marriage, which initially seemed like a promise of love and stability, became a prison, and the idea that she was losing her own identity began to deeply corrode her soul. It was at this point of despair that the idea of disappearing began to take shape. Audrey knew that if she stayed, she would remain a shadow of herself. The emotional pain of constant psychological oppression consumed her, and, it seems, she reached a point of absolute despair where the only option she saw was to run away to live, to finally have the chance to be who she truly wanted to be. But escaping wasn't a simple task. To disappear, Audrey had to meticulously plan every detail. She knew that if she left any trace, her decision would be easily reversed, and she would return to square one, to the cycle of abuse and control she was trying to escape. So, she made the decision to vanish without leaving anything behind. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She didn't ask friends or relatives for help, and she didn't leave any kind of clue. For her, the only way to truly break free was to cut all ties with the past. She didn't take the train or the bus to the next town, as many thought. It wasn't a simple escape. Audrey did something completely different. She hitchhiked at a very specific moment, intending to follow a route that would take her further and further away from the life she knew. She went to unknown places, distancing herself from anywhere that might remind her of her previous life. The idea of being recognized, of being found, wasn't part of the plan. She went towards the unknown, in search of a new beginning. And that's how Audrey entered a new world, a world where she was no longer Audrey from Reedsburg. She was no longer the young woman from an abusive marriage. She transformed into someone new, with a new name, in a new city, where no one knew her past. She built a new identity, a new life, taking great care never to leave a trace. Audrey chose to disappear to live in peace, but also to protect herself. She knew that the life she left behind was full of trauma and painful memories, and she simply didn't want to be that person anymore. Over the years, she reinvented herself, creating a new version of herself, without caring what others thought. She remarried, built a family, and moved on with her life, never looking back. But then, why did Audrey decide to reveal herself in 2025? What made her change her mind and contact the authorities? What happened in her life that made her, after so long, decide it was time to end her own mystery? The answer to this question is more complex than it seems, and the real reason may be something only Audrey fully understands. Something much deeper than any simple explanation. She always knew that the decision she made that day in 1962 would change everything, but perhaps she never imagined how much it would affect the people around her. She couldn't predict how the world would react to her disappearance, nor the consequences for her family and friends. But what was most surprising was the fact that, even after so much time, Audrey never regretted her choice. And now, with the mystery finally beginning to unravel, Audrey's true story is closer to being fully revealed. But many questions remain unanswered, and what follows may change how we view the disappearance and reconstruction of a life. More than 60 years after her disappearance, generated an explosive reaction and a wave of interest, both locally and nationally. For many, Audrey's return seemed an almost impossible event, a tale that could only exist in mystery stories. The idea that a woman, presumed missing for so long, could reappear alive and well, changed not only her life, but also the perception of everyone around her. When Audrey first made contact with the authorities in 2025, no one knew what to expect. The initial conversations between her and the police were marked by mutual caution. Audrey, who had kept her identity secret all these years, didn't want to be seen as a public figure. She had disappeared to live in peace, and that peace was all she wanted to continue having. However, the world wasn't ready to receive someone with such a shocking past. The authorities' initial reaction was undoubtedly one of surprise and curiosity, but also of some unease. After all, Audrey had made a difficult choice, a choice that, while understandable in emotional and psychological terms, left many questions unanswered. The police began to wonder why she had decided to hide for so long. Was her decision to disappear a legitimate act of self-preservation? Or was there something more behind it? The impact on her family was equally great. Audrey's relatives, who had spent more than 6 decades without knowing what had happened to her, were now confronted with the reality that their sister, daughter, or wife had made a choice to completely withdraw from everything and everyone. For many, this return was simultaneously a relief and a profound pain. Relief because Audrey was alive, but pain because her decision to distance herself from her family so radically was something they could never have foreseen. Audrey's elderly parents reacted in different ways. Some family members were happy to know she was all right, while others were deeply hurt and confused by the way Audrey had cut all ties with them. Throughout her life, there had been a void, a lack of explanation that, now filled, brought a difficult truth to bear. The media, of course, played a central role in this discovery. As a story that captured the public's imagination and stirred everyone's emotions, Audrey's case became a national sensation. Reports about her disappearance and return were widely disseminated. Television news programs, newspapers, and news websites rushed to cover the details of her return, and the story quickly spread. Documentaries, interviews, and radio programs began to explore Audrey's case. But something still lingered. Was the press being fair in its treatment? Or were they irreparably invading Audrey's privacy? For Audrey, the media attention was undoubtedly disconcerting and uncomfortable. Throughout the years, she lived under a new identity. Her greatest desire had always been privacy. She wanted to live without the weight of the past, without being constantly reminded of what she had left behind. However, with her story exposed to the world's attention, Audrey found herself forced to deal with attention she hadn't asked for, but which was now unavoidable. She began to question to what extent her personal story should be shared. The line between the right to live in peace and the public's right to know the truth seemed thinner than ever. The journalists, in turn, had a mission to uncover the most intimate details of Audrey's life. What were the reasons for her disappearance? How did she feel about making that choice? Where did she spend all those years? What were the most difficult moments of her journey? The questions kept coming, but Audrey kept her answers limited. She knew that any word spoken could open doors she didn't want to open. The media pressure was immense, but Audrey remained firm in her decision not to share all the details of her experience. She had the right to keep certain aspects of her life secret. Despite this, public curiosity only increased. Some wanted to know why she had left her family and friends behind. Others were more concerned with how she managed to hide for so long, maintaining a completely new identity, away from everyone's attention. At the same time, theories emerged about what might have happened to her. Some believed that Audrey had been forced to disappear by external circumstances, such as a threat to her safety, or even involvement in something illegal. Others, more optimistic, saw her disappearance as a form of self-preservation, as if Audrey had found a way to escape the pain and rebuild her life peacefully. But the fact was that no one knew for sure, and Audrey was not willing to fully clarify these points. The impact on society was also profound. The Audrey Backeberg case raised questions about a person's right to live their life the way they choose, even when it means disappearing from the radar. Did the media have the right to exploit Audrey's story? And, even more importantly, did Audrey have the right to start her life anew without being haunted by the past? With each interview and public appearance, Audrey seemed to distance herself further from the idea of being a victim and moved closer to being seen as a woman who had made a choice, and that choice had defined her. While sensationalist media tried to exploit her story in a way that would appeal to the public, Audrey maintained her firm stance. She wasn't interested in being part of a spectacle. She wanted, finally, the peace she had always longed for. And so, Audrey's story unfolded in deeper layers. While the world began to understand the impact of her decision to disappear, Audrey knew that the true mystery had not yet been fully unraveled. The reason behind her disappearance, the way she reinvented herself, and the reasons why she chose to reappear only now, after so much time, were still shrouded in untold secrets, and so, the case of Audrey Backeberg continued to fascinate, intrigue, and leave everyone wanting to know more. The complete answer was in sight, but the end of this story was still far off. As Audrey Backeberg's story spread across the country, the media continued to insist on its version of events, trying to find an answer to the question everyone was asking: why had Audrey returned now, after so long? Interviews, documentaries, and public appearances, while revealing in some respects, only added more layers of mystery to her story. The woman who once disappeared without a trace was now before everyone. But what was the real reason for her return? While the world was fascinated by the idea of a disappearance that lasted more than 6 decades, one question echoed in the minds of many. Why didn't she reveal the whole truth? Audrey, by her own choice, had decided to keep many details of her life secret, and what seemed to be a story of resilience and survival was becoming increasingly enigmatic. She still hadn't fully opened up about the years she was missing, and this lack of clarity only fueled the information void that everyone wanted to fill. Behind the scenes, Audrey was beginning to feel the weight of this attention. Although she had achieved a certain peace and stability in her new life, the public focus on her was beginning to crumble the armor carefully constructed over decades. She had started a new life, but now, with the public exposure, her past was threatening to invade her present. This forced her to reflect on what she truly wanted: to maintain her privacy, or to finally confront what had been left behind. In her mind, Audrey knew that upon reappearing, her life would never be the same. She was forced to live with the constant reminder that her choices had affected many people: her family, friends, and even the strangers who followed her through the news reports. She knew that by doing so, she was opening a Pandora's box that could no longer be closed. The media attention, which had initially been a burden, began to transform into increasing psychological pressure. But what she truly feared was the idea of reliving her past. However, there was a deeper feeling within Audrey. She didn't want to be seen merely as a woman who had run away from her past, or as a media figure. She didn't want to be the victim of her own story. Instead, Audrey wanted to be seen as someone who made the hardest and yet most important choice of her life: to run away to live, not to escape fear, but to seek freedom. She didn't want to be defined by her circumstances, or worse, to be labeled by those who didn't understand what she had lived through. Audrey's future seemed as uncertain as her past. The decision to reveal herself to the world hadn't been easy, but she knew that, in doing so, she had opened a chapter that could no longer be closed. She also knew that people's expectations would be extremely high. Many expected her to explain herself, to give a clear reason for what she had done. But what did Audrey really want? She wanted to return to her new life, where she could be whoever she wanted to be, without having to justify her decisions. She wanted to be treated as a courageous woman who had made a difficult but valid decision for her own survival. Interviews and public appearances began to reveal a different Audrey than the woman people imagined. She no longer wanted to be a heroine, nor a victim. She wanted to be recognized as someone who made difficult but necessary choices. Her story wasn't about escaping the past, but about finding a future amidst chaos. She wanted people to see in her the strength of someone who did the unthinkable to stay alive. For Audrey, the disappearance was the last chance to escape a suffocating fate. But what she truly couldn't foresee was that her story wouldn't be just hers. It would become a global phenomenon. Still, the questions surrounding her life were inescapable. Many wanted to understand what she had done all those years. Where did she live? Who had she become? How was it possible to live without contact with her family? How, after all, did she manage to hide her identity for so long? The truth was that Audrey never fully answered these questions, and perhaps never will. She simply didn't want to go back to being the woman of 1962, the one who disappeared in search of a new beginning. She no longer wanted to be a mystery to the world. For her, true freedom lay in living the life she had chosen, without further explanations. However, the media's impact on her life remained a great unknown. The constant attention was suffocating, and Audrey began to wonder if this public exposure was worth it. She was repeatedly reminded of her radical decision to disappear, and often questioned whether she could have kept her new private life private. Could her peace be regained, or would this new phase of her life be marked by the public's constant search for answers? Audrey Backeberg's return also sparked a discussion about the right to start over. Some people saw her decision to disappear as a manifestation of courage, while others saw it as a cowardly escape. However, most seemed to understand that the decision to disappear was far from simple. What she did was an attempt to save herself, to reclaim her own identity in a world that was trying to destroy her. And, while the world still didn't have a clear answer about her motivations, Audrey continued to live her new life as quietly as possible, away from the spotlight, but, at the same time, aware that the past could never be forgotten. As time passed, the world began to understand that what truly mattered was Audrey's future. More than what had happened in the past, but would she finally be able to move on without looking back? Or, like so many before her, would she be trapped by the weight of her own choices? As Audrey Backeberg's story unfolded before a global audience, what seemed to be the end of a mystery actually opened even more doors to unanswered questions. The mystery that began with her disappearance in 1962 and took on new dimensions with her return in 2025 still reverberated in people's minds. After all, what did Audrey truly achieve with her choice to disappear? Had she fled to find freedom or simply to escape an unbearable reality? Now, by appearing publicly, she seemed to be confronting the ghosts of the past once more. Audrey's return, though expected, was not easy. For her, the decision to return to the public eye was not something she took lightly. She knew the consequences would be inevitable. The media, people's curiosity, the incessant questions about what she had done all those years, and, most painfully, the reactions of her family, who didn't know what to think about her decision to disappear. But however much Audrey tried to explain that her escape wasn't just about hiding, but about saving herself, the world didn't seem ready to accept that explanation as sufficient. Audrey's choice to disappear and start a new life brought to the forefront philosophical and ethical questions about a person's right to start over. She had been a prisoner of her own life, and disappearing was her way of finally taking control of her destiny. But however much her escape was understood as a form of self-preservation, many people still couldn't see her decision without judgment. Did she really have the right to disappear like that without further explanation? Without warning? And now, by revealing herself, was she doing the right thing? Or was she simply reliving the past in an even more painful way? The reaction from her family, as expected, was a mixture of feelings. Some, especially those who were still alive and loved her, were relieved to know she was alive. But at the same time, they were deeply hurt by the way Audrey had decided to cut all ties with them. Her sister, in particular, publicly stated that, although happy for her safety, she felt great pain for not having had the chance to support Audrey during such difficult times. For decades, she had wondered, day after day, where her beloved sister was and what had happened. Now, confronted with the truth, her pain was even more acute. She felt that Audrey's absence in her life had been a void that could never be filled. But at the same time, this absence also gave Audrey space to be who she truly wanted to be. The decision to disappear allowed her to finally rebuild her identity. During all the years she was missing, she lived a life that, in a way, freed her from the shackles of a past she no longer wanted. Her new life was marked by relationships and choices that were not tainted by the emotional abuse she had experienced. She found a new family, with a new husband, and seemed to have found peace. But was this really the end? Could Audrey move on and live without looking back? Or would the weight of the past always haunt her? Reflecting on her own journey, Audrey knew that what she had done was what she felt was necessary at that moment. She didn't regret her choices, although she knew that to others, her decision might seem selfish or even incomprehensible. She had done the unthinkable to save herself, but saving herself didn't mean she would be exempt from the pain and consequences of her actions. She knew that, even if she had made the right choice for her own survival, the way others saw her was still a heavy burden. How could she live in peace knowing that her decision had impacted so many of those she loved most? Furthermore, Audrey's legacy was being shaped in a very different way than she had imagined. By reappearing and giving interviews, she was becoming a public figure. What began as an act of self-preservation and escape was now transforming into something much bigger. People began to see her as a symbol of freedom and resistance, but also as someone who made difficult decisions and, in doing so, profoundly affected those around her. This brought with it a series of reflections on the cost of personal freedom and how individual choices can have a ripple effect on the lives of others. The fact that Audrey didn't reveal all the details of her life during the 60 years she was missing, that she didn't fully open up about what she went through, left a bitter taste in the mouths of many. What was she hiding? What did she really go through during those years? Many believed there was more, much more, behind Audrey's decision, but perhaps what she wanted to show the world was that not everything in life needs to be explained, especially when it comes to deeply personal decisions, and perhaps that was the real key to her story, the idea that life is not something we can fully control. Sometimes, the moments that define who we are not planned, but rather desperate responses to circumstances beyond our control. And by choosing to disappear, Audrey wasn't simply running away, but trying to maintain control over her own narrative, over who she wanted to be. She wanted to be seen as a woman of courage, someone who, even when everything seemed lost, did what she needed to do to find her own salvation. Today, Audrey Backeberg's story continues to resonate as a reminder that the right to start over is something profound and personal. Her decision to disappear and then reveal herself to the world became not only a story of disappearance, but also a story of resilience and survival. A story that shows that, however difficult it may be, the right to start over is always within reach of those who are willing to do the impossible to find peace. The case of Audrey Backeberg is one of those mysteries that cannot be solved by a simple explanation. Her decision to disappear in 1962, in search of freedom and safety, was a choice that defied all the conventions of the time. Even though years have passed and questions remain unanswered, the true essence of Audrey's story lies not only in her disappearance, but in her decision to start her life anew, even if it meant cutting ties with everything she knew. When Audrey revealed herself to the world in 2025, her return brought not only answers, but also new, complex, and meaningful questions. How can someone live under a new identity for so long, leaving behind everything they knew, all the people they loved? The answer, as she herself said, lies in the need to save herself, to escape a life that no longer defined her. But in doing so, Audrey made it clear that, although her choices had led her to peace and freedom, the weight of those choices would never completely disappear. The pain of her family, the relentless curiosity of the media, and the judgment of the public were inevitable. But Audrey never sought acceptance from anyone but herself. She had made the hardest decision of her life, to flee in order to preserve her integrity. And, over time, she built a new identity, a new life, a new purpose. Her return, then, was more than an act of revelation. It was a way of finally taking control of the narrative of her own story, free from the shackles of the past. The mystery surrounding her disappearance, the way she vanished without a trace, may never have a definitive explanation. Perhaps that's what makes her even more fascinating. Her decision not to be defined by the circumstances that made her a victim, but by her own ability to rewrite her own path. Audrey's legacy isn't simply about what she did or didn't do, but about the right everyone has to start over, even when society doesn't understand or questions that right. Looking at Audrey's life, one cannot help but reflect on what we are willing to do to find our own freedom, what we are willing to leave behind in the name of our emotional survival. Audrey Backeberg's case is not just a story of disappearance, but a story of resilience, courage, and choice. She teaches us that sometimes, to truly live, it is necessary to distance oneself from everything and everyone, to finally be who we are. Audrey found her peace, although the price was high. Over the years, she managed to build a life of her own, free from the shadows of a past that oppressed her. And even after decades of silence, she decided, at the right moment, to give voice to her story, not for others, but for herself. Today, Audrey's story still resonates as a reminder that true freedom can lie in the right to start over, even when everything you know is left behind. Her life is a testament to the fact that we are not prisoners of circumstance, but rather of the choices we make to set ourselves free. And so the mystery of Audrey Backeberg, with all its emotional nuances and complexities, finally comes to an end. But the question that remains for all of us is, what are we willing to do to rewrite our own stories?